Good afternoon. Welcome to the 1330 track. We have our speakers, Sam and Bobby, with the title Clearing the Fog, Unveiling the Latest Ransomware Trickery. Sam is a security researcher for Beazley Security, and Bobby is a principal researcher at Beazley Security.
Alrighty, hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking about a new ransom group called FOG, or FOG Ransomware. But before we get started, like you said, my name is Sam Mayers. I'm a security researcher at Beazley Security. In my free time, I run a nonprofit called ClearSearch, which is a CTI kind of empowerment nonprofit where we give pretty much a giant data lake to researchers to help them do their research.
And I'm Bobby. I'm the principal security researcher on the Beazley security team. My background is in mostly malware analysis, but also I worked in the SOC for a while.
All right, so this is going to be the agenda. So we're going to talk about a little bit about FOG ransomware as a whole, the locker itself, and then a little bit of analysts, TTPs and IOCs, Akira and FOG and how they kind of overlap, and then just some closing thoughts. So FOG ransomware began at the beginning of May 2024 to about mid 2024. So far, as of 10/22, there was 32 publicly known companies that were attacked via their leak site. And then the main industry is the US. There's a couple other industries. You see Canada, Australia, but they're mainly targeting the US. And before we came on stage, I realized that there was a lot more hits, so I needed to update my slides. So now there is 40 as of 10/25. Still US kind of growing a little bit more in the percentage. And then I lied again. So now as of the 30th, there's 45. So within a week, they hit about, I don't know, I think it's 13 companies, and that percentage of the US went up 10%. So they are very much targeting the US. And then I love looking at the industries. So this is what they claim. It's really a disgusting graph, but their industries when they claim the company. So it's a lot of overlapping and doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I've condensed it a lot. They're mainly targeting education. The first articles that came out about this, it was very much education based. That's what everyone was saying. We're seeing more of a trend now towards manufacturers. As of the last couple of hits, a lot of manufacturing in different industries, not one specific manufacturer. So, you know, okay. So yeah, but there's plenty of other industries like food and beverage and service as well that is getting hit. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the kill chain of kind of how we have came across, or one of the IRs we had for FOG ransomware. So we have the threat actor, and what they did was they used compromised VPN credentials, and usually they either get that by either an info stealer and they buy it off of the info stealers, or they brute force it if your VPN credentials are very weak. After, they use a technique called pass the hash, which they use to gain administrator account controls and then establish RDP to Windows Server. After that, they use RDP, SMB, and PSExec to spread throughout the network and kind of discover what else is there. And then they disable Windows Defender because they don't want Windows Defender to recognize they download the ransom. They download the ransom and they deploy it. They use a PowerShell script that they use, and it pretty much encrypts hypervisors VMDK files, which are virtual machine disk files. They delete Vim backup storage. They encrypt both local and shared networks and remove volume storage copies.
Okay. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the locker analysis. So within the context of ransomware, whenever we talk about a locker, the locker is the actual file that does all the encryption of your valuable data. So whenever a hacker breaks into your network and is able to spread around all over the place, what they'll then do is after they've, as Sam described, after they turn off your defenses, That's when they bring the locker program in, deploy it everywhere, and then drop the ransom notes. And as we mentioned, so we started our following of FOG because of an incident case. An IR team that we support, they had a FOG case and they reached out to us. They were like, hey, we've never heard of this ransomware group before. What do you guys know about them? And when we did our Googling, we were like, there's nothing known about these guys. Like, they're brand new. There's no information, no nothing. So we had to quickly figure out a way to start tracking these guys and seeing, learning about their operations and everything. So this talk is a little bit about how we built that process. Soon after the case happened, a company called Arctic Wolf released a blog about FOG, and it was it's a pretty good blog. It has had a lot of good, thorough information on their operations. They listed a lot of samples, and unfortunately for us, all the samples that they had, there was only one available, publicly available on VirusTotal, which doesn't help us very much because we need a lot of samples to study, but we'll take what we can get. So we grabbed the sample, and the first thing we took a look at was, do other researchers recognize this as FOG, or do they know that this is a FOG ransomware sample? The way that you can see that is in VirusTotal, are any AV companies tagging this with FOG, the ransom name? And a good thing was we found that about a month after FOG debuted, people were already starting to tag them as FOG, which is helpful for us because then we can go on VirusTotal and search on that tag and find more samples to study. So we did that, and we found 7 more samples. Okay, so this graph is a little weird looking, I know. Basically what I'm showing you here is that between May and now, we've been able to find, spoiler alert, about 20 samples of FOG. That's it. Which is weird because most other ransomware operators, there's a lot of samples out there because they're operating a lot. But FOG is really quiet. We don't know why, but they don't operate a lot. People like, or groups like Ransomware or Ransom Hub and Lockbit, you'll see waves where there'll be like 30 infections in a weekend or something. But with FOG, there'll be nothing for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then there'll be like 7 cases, which is, it's a very low cadence, but they're there. And then again, this talk, my section will be how we got from 7 samples to about 20. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we needed to look statically at the samples to see if there's anything that you can notice about them on the surface to do searches on, right? The Arctic Wolf article that they wrote about them, they describe this system that they have within FOG. It's a debug log system. And basically what happens is when you're an affiliate and you download the sample to a target network that you've broken into, if the FOG sample isn't working right, if it's breaking or whatever, there's helpful little debug log statements that they put on the system for you, for the operators. And the weird thing is they didn't try to hide any of the logging statements, so you can just search samples for those logging statements. So we did that. The other thing we did is we checked to see its behavior and the way it behaves in a sandbox, because you can search those in VirusTotal too. And I know you probably can't, this is a section of code from FOG. I know you probably can't read it. It's not that important. Really all you got to know is that on the right side there, what's happening is at the top, FOG starts running. It unpacks its internal configuration. It reads it so it knows where it needs to go, what it needs to do. It's got its keys in there and everything. And then it starts doing bad stuff on the right side there. It'll start killing services, killing processes, all that kind of stuff. On the left side, what we found out is that for FOG, when you're running it, if you don't pass it any parameters, it just exits out. So on any given sandbox, if the sandbox doesn't know to pass it parameters, you won't see it acting like ransomware, like VirusTotal. But what is helpful is that even though it won't do anything, like ransom-wise, it won't encrypt any files, it will drop that debug log file. So that's a good indicator. You can search that behaviorally, and it makes for a good threat hunt and for a good search indicator in VirusTotal. So with our static search on the left side and our dynamic search on the right side, we built those into searches in VirusTotal, and we got up to about 19 samples. So pretty good. And I want to dive into one of the samples that we found that was kind of actually an interesting case. So one of the samples that turns up when you search for FOG on behaviors is this zip file. The zip file has a FOG locker inside of it, and it's next to a bunch of other weird stuff. You'll see a FireEye, which is a security product, but then you also see Cafion, Code Sector, and Hyperius Backup. Those are actually file transfer utilities and backup utilities. And that's common for ransomware actors. What they'll usually do is when they get onto your network, they'll want to take as much data as they can and then exfiltrate it and bring it to their attack servers so that they can double extort you. What they'll do is they'll deploy the ransomware and then say, you need to pay us this ransom money and then we'll unlock the stuff for you. And then after you do that, they may also say, you need to also pay us this ransom or else we're going to leak the data that we stole from you. And so that's what you're looking at here is basically the threat actor tool set that was captured. You also see an ntuser.dat file. I'm not a pen tester, but I took a class once, and I think I learned that like the ntuser file, it's got recon information in it. You can use it to enumerate and look at information about users on a target system. The other thing that we found, they installed in the start menu something called Advanced IP Scanner. The reason that kind of like piqued my interest is because when you read the Arctic Wolf article, they mention a tool that they use called Advanced Host Scanner. This thing is named the same, and when you look at the web pages for both those products, they look the same. So this is really starting to look like a case file for an IR case for a fog infection. It's basically like the digital equivalent of a crime scene, right? And then within VirusTotal, this thing was uploaded from Brazil on 7/26. Now, what's very interesting about that is that we've been tracking the cases for fog, at least that have been publicly reported, and there's none from Brazil. So this, the other thing too is that the zip file, it's the name of the zip file matches a company that is a software services company in Brazil. So we're pretty sure this is the case file for a fog infection case that ended up not being public. So we didn't want to dig too deep into it because this is someone's private data. But anyway, interesting finding, right? Okay. So we still needed to really deep dive into the study and see if we could figure out more about the sample itself at a code level, at a binary code level. So I apologize, but it's about to get nerdy in here. Okay, so we started off with the 7 samples that we had. Now there's a really cool feature in VirusTotal that my colleague Sam showed me that that you can go to VirusTotal and say, here's 7 samples. Can you show me the similarities across all 7? And it will try to do things like it'll say, hey, here's a pattern of bytes that show up in 4 of the samples. Or here's a pattern of bytes that show up in 5 of the samples. What was really cool is that it showed us for these 7 fog samples, here's 9 byte patterns that show up in all 7 samples. Very super interesting for us. And I'm sorry, besides, I'm not about to draw 120 arrows and circles going everywhere. But you can kind of imagine what that graph was supposed to look like, right? Every one of those byte patterns showed up in every single one of the samples. So they're important, right? So we needed to understand what those byte patterns were. So when we looked at them, some of them are not important. Some of them are just strings. Some of them are data structures that are not actual code. But 4 of them were. And the interesting things about those 4 bits of code is they always showed up really close together. And again, they were in every single fog sample that we were looking at. So we're like, well, this is code, and it's in every single sample, so it's probably important. Let's make a signature and see what happens, right? We also needed to go into that code and see what actually it was doing. So it turns out in any given fog sample, there's a section here of code, and it's the same code that I was showing earlier. This is the code that starts the program, unpacks its internal configuration, reads its configuration, and then starts doing bad stuff. That part where it's unpacking the configuration, it's not too complicated. It looks like this, and there's a section of code that looks like that, and that is where those 4 shared code bytes are. So those 4 bits of shared code, it has to do with its unpacking its internal configuration. And that's important code for any given ransomware sample, right? The configuration is what tells the ransomware sample, here's your encryption key to how to lock all these files. Here's the files that I want you to target. Here's the file extension I want you to leave once you've encrypted a piece of data, right? And so we made a signature out of that, and we tested it out, and to our delight, it fires only on the executable signatures, right? The signature does, or only on the executable files, which is good. It shows that the signature is effective. It fires on all the fog samples that we know about, and it doesn't fire on anything else, so the signature is safe. It doesn't produce any false positives. Now what this means is that this signature that we made out of those 4 byte patterns, it can basically function as a fingerprint, right? You can use that to sort of identify, hey, this is definitely a fog sample. And then something really weird showed up when we ran it in VirusTotal. It pulled up one more sample that was file named unlocker.out, right? And this thing is the, so whenever you get ransom, what will happen is your files will get encrypted, a note will get dropped, and then the operators will say, all right, we've locked all your stuff, give us some Bitcoin, and then we'll unlock it for you. If you pay, usually what will happen is they'll send you either the unlocker file itself, or they'll have someone run it for you to unlock your data. And this signature pulled up an unlocker. And we were wondering why we didn't see it earlier in our searches. It turns out that the unlocker has the same debug log functionality, but it has less debug log statements. So we had set a threshold of 60 earlier. That's why we didn't see it in the previous search. Also, for behavior-wise, it drops that debug log that the other sample does, but it prepends the word unlocker to the front of it. That's why it didn't show up in the other search, in the dynamic search. But the fingerprint signature worked for it. The other thing that's interesting too is that so other AV companies, when they look at this sample, the unlocker, they flag it as malicious, but they don't flag it as fog. So right now, we're the only ones that are recognizing it as a fog sample. So we were excited about that. Okay, and then that fingerprint, what's neat about it is that it's still catching stuff. Like a week ago, it caught another unlocker. And that unlocker, there's some information from it here. It was uploaded from Ireland. And again, we're watching the leak sites. There's no reported sites from Ireland. So this is another unreported case. Likely what happened is they paid the ransom, got their unlocker, and they never showed up on the leak site. So they're non-public. So it's a good way to monitor them, that's what you can say. Okay. So we have a process now. We got a way to look for new fog samples, find new samples that are showing up, understand them, all that kind of stuff. The case that we worked actually also had a Linux sample in it, which is very interesting too. And that Linux sample, it ransomed an ESXi server, which can be really scary if you're in IT because ESXi servers, those are typically what you're running all your VMs on. So usually what happens is an ESXi server will have like a web server on it, a file server, and all other kinds of servers. Well, ransomware operators have figured out the value of that kind of server, and now what they'll do is they'll get on that server and ransom all your VMs on it. And so we had a sample of that type of locker. Okay, so as a review, like the way that we're going to approach the Linux sample is going to be similar. Are any AVs tagging it? Is there any static things about it that we can use to find more of them? Is there dynamic behavior that we can search on and write signatures for? And then is there any way we can write like a code level fingerprint signature against them? Okay, so with a Linux sample, again, like luckily a couple AV companies were tagging it as fog, so that's good. Unfortunately, when we ran the search, we only got 4 samples, and that's all we can find so far. So there's not a whole lot known about the Linux capabilities of fog ransomware. It has debug log strings in it as well, but there's not a whole lot of them. And when we tried signatures based on that, it only found those 4. It didn't find us anymore. For behavior, the Linux sample has even less behavior in a sandbox than the Windows sample does. And we found out it's because there's an embedded password inside the Linux sample. If you don't pass it the right password, it just shuts off. And even though it does have a debug log, it does not drop the debug log. Its default behavior is to log to the terminal, not drop the file. And so there's no behavior to look for whenever you're threat hunting for a sample, if it hasn't been executed. Okay. So we had to sort of study a little bit more about it and figure out if there's like a better way to understand these samples. Yeah. So this shows where it's only logging to the terminal and not to a file. Okay. So now because I couldn't find much from signature analysis or from static analysis and dynamic analysis, I had to again do the binary dive. And so we started off with the same thing. We asked VirusTotal, hey, can you show us similarities between all these 3 samples? And it gave us 20 patterns that show up in all 3. So I was like, oh, awesome. But when I went in and looked at them, none of them were code. It was all data. So it was no shared code between the 3 samples, at least none that was easily viewable by a static analysis. So I had to basically throw all that away. And I kind of freaked out a little bit because I only have 3 samples right now, and we need to understand this Linux malware. But it's okay, right? F it, we're going to do it live. We're just going to take these samples, we're going to toss them into IDA, we're going to put on our big boy pants and analyze it and see if we can analyze it with understanding, right? Okay. And thankfully, so again, they don't try to hide too much of how they operate, right? And funny enough, like if you use Linux utilities, a lot of times if you just run the utility but you don't pass anything, it'll give you usage strings. And the fog sample does the same thing. If you run the fog sample, it will tell you, hey, you didn't give me enough parameters. Here's the parameters you're supposed to give me. And it shows you like what the functionality of the fog's Linux sample is. And funny enough too, it also gives you build data. So it'll tell, like the fog creators built right into the command line, they'll tell you when that build was built. And it's helpful for us for tracking, the growth of samples and changes of samples too. Also, Built within the sample were the embedded ESXi commands that it's going to use to do recon. So you can see there, it's going to run EXCLI storage file system. These are basically how it's going to do recon on your system before it starts ransoming everything there. And these are indicators. You can build threat hunts off of knowing that these commands will be run on a FOG Linux sample. Okay. Also, we found within there, this is the list of targeted file types. So these are all the file extensions that FOG will try to ransom if it's executed on your computer. Okay, and then while digging around, there was one section that was interesting. So you'll see here that set encode position. This is a section of code where once it finds an interesting file that it wants to ransom, it will set a position in the file, and then it runs this little loop. This little loop is basically pulling in a bunch of bytes, it's shifting them, and then it writes them out to the file again. That's where all the shifting is happening. And so because all the samples had that little loop, I was like, well, maybe that will work as a fingerprint signature as well. So we tried that, and it pulled up another unlocker. This time it was the Linux unlocker, which was kind of cool. Like, that's a nice finding. So we needed to study why why all 4 Linux samples had that specific loop in it that does a bunch of byte mess ups, right? And this loop exists within the function that encrypts your files. So it has something to do with that. And I need to go into a little bit of how ransomware authors use keys, right? So public key cryptography, basically what happens is you to encrypt stuff with public key, you've got a private key and a public key. You encrypt with your private key, you send out your public key, and people can decrypt things with your public key. Ransomware authors, the way that they'll use it is when they are getting ready to ransom a target, they'll set up the unlocker with the private key. They'll send the locker over to you. The operators will run it on your stuff using the public key, and they will encrypt all your stuff. You then have to send them Bitcoin, and what they will then do is if you pay, they will run the unlocker on your system to unlock your files. Everything's good. And the reason that's done is because in this stage right here, once they've locked your files, there's a chance that some researchers can look at the algorithm you use to encrypt your files and just reverse it and unlock all your stuff. That's a lot harder if you're using proper public key cryptography. And it's interesting that ransomware operators use this in their software because it's a fairly simple system, but it's easy to mess up when you implement this. And if you're a ransomware operator and you don't implement your public key cryptography correctly, all kinds of stuff happens to you. Researchers will study your stuff, they will bust you up, and they will embarrass you by releasing decryptors on their own. And this happens with quite frequently, a lot more often than I thought. These examples are all within this year, most of them. But these are researchers that studied the cryptography implementation of a ransomware operator and reversed it so they could write unlockers. And so in the Windows sample, you can see them using public key cryptography. This is the library functions that use for encrypting. You can see them here referencing RSA public key, which is it's a shared key cryptography. But what was interesting about the Linux sample is that for some reason the Linux sample, it doesn't call any crypto functions, which is really weird for us to see. This is the loop, or this is the process tree that does the encryption of your files. And within that process tree, this is the only thing that's doing byte munging. For whatever reason, there's no calls to cryptography libraries within the function call that encrypts your files. So what that tells me is that I think that their Linux locker is not using proper cryptography. They're just munging your bytes with a loop. So all we have to do, I think, if I'm correct, is we study this, we see what they did, manipulations to encrypt your stuff, and you just reverse it, and you've got an unlocker. And I don't want to jump the gun. That would be a huge finding, and we haven't verified if that's exactly what's happening, but it looks that way because, again, the Linux sample does not pull in crypto libraries, which is really weird for a locker sample to do. So that's going to be future work for us. Those samples those 3 samples are public though, so feel free to download them yourself and verify our work to see, maybe we can make a decryptor. So back off to Sam.
All right. So there's been a couple of articles recently about the overlap of FOG and Akira. Akira is another ransom group. I'm not going to go super in depth with them, but there is a lot of overlap with them. But there is a couple of differences that show that they are two different groups. FOG started this year, Akira started last year. FOG's really targeting, like I showed before, US education slash manufacturing industries, where Akira really does not care. They will encrypt anyone pretty much in the West in any industry. As long as they can encrypt it and get money, they will. FOG exploits compromised VPN credentials, where Akira exploits VPN vulnerabilities. So that's a little bit of a difference that people have been kind of seeing and kind of just correlating together. And then FOG really just gets in, encrypts, and tries to get money, where Akira is very popular with double extortion, trying to pressure, and any other tactics they can doing that. And then obviously different extensions when they actually encrypt the files. But recently we've noticed that they both have been using two similar CVEs, as well as they're both financially driven threat actors, like most ransom groups. And then those two CVEs are two VPN, or not VPN, excuse me, two vulnerabilities on the front ending of your infrastructure. So the first one is the sonic wall, which pretty much just leads to unauthorized access, and then causes your firewall crash, sorry. And then the other one is Vim. It just allows you to pretty much get RCE on the system, and then they get in. So two very big vulnerabilities that came out this year, and obviously they're still using it, so people have not patched their stuff, so please patch your infrastructure, pretty please. But this is stuff we're still seeing daily, that they're using these two CVEs. Now some TTPs for FOG itself. There's some really interesting things that FOG does. This is a pretty graphic, but I'm going to quickly run over it because I don't want to bore everyone with MITRE ATT&CK. But they get in, they use validated credentials, buying it like I said before. They use a Windows shell script to run commands through. They create local administrator accounts if they can. If not, they will use pass the hash to try to get into administrator accounts. They validate accounts, delete files, encrypt files, and then, like I said before, they use pass the hash, which is just an unauthenticated way to get passwords and use it as clear, and not having it clear text, kind of just using the hash to encrypt it, or unencrypt it. And then they disable Windows Defender. They also use NTD for credential dumping and other credential dumping techniques and brute forcing. They do a lot of network scanning. They really are not good at getting in at one place. They don't care where they get in, so they use a lot of like network scanning and port scanning to kind of figure out where they are in the network, and then kind of move laterally from there. And then use RDP and SMB like I talked about before for lateral movement, as well as a couple other lateral movement tools. And then, like all ransomware groups, they stop services and then either encrypt, like they are doing here, and then make it so you can't recover your data. So something interesting with FOG is they really only use open source tooling. So any of these tools, you can just search them and grab them yourself. They don't really have any internal tooling that they're using. So they use PSExec, which moves laterally, and a lot of ransomware groups use that. They also use Metasploit and those network and port scanners like I talked about a second ago. But what's interesting is both the network scan and port scan are two different softwares and companies, but they have very similar websites. I haven't had a chance to really dig into those two tools and like kind of see what they do differently, but they seem very similar. Besides, obviously, network and port, very similar in name and whatnot, but they seem to be just kind of copies of themselves on their websites. And then they use this open source script called VM Get Credentials, and so you could just go on GitHub and find it, but it's just a way to get obtain passwords from VM backups and replicate credential managers, so that's a way that they use to get passwords. So their ransom notes, at the beginning, the first month or so, we were seeing help_your_files.html. What was interesting is you really don't see .html as ransom notes for ransom groups. You really see .txt. I think they kind of realized that after a little bit and changed theirs to readme.txt. So now you're seeing that kind of standard all over. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the actual ransom note from one of our IR cases. And pretty much you go to this Tor link, they say that they're fogged, and then you enter this code to enter a chat room, and then communicate with them and try to either negotiate or just pay the ransom outright. So their file extensions, like I was saying before, is .fog or .flock. .flock was what they did the first month or so as well when that .html readme was. But now they've kind of just changed to .fog. And then on the right is their name and shame site. That's where you kind of can go to their Tor site. You can download any victims' data, anything like that. You could just go there right away. And what's interesting is they spelled it's wrong. And it's been there for a very long time, and it really annoys me, but it also makes me really happy that they can't spell simple words right, and that just makes me feel better with my English. But yeah, so that's just a screenshot that I pulled recently of their Tor site. So a couple things. Why should any of you guys care? I'm going to assume most of you are not in the education sector, but ransom as a whole is hitting every sector. Maybe not FOG specifically is hitting your sector, but every sector, like name me a sector, I can tell you probably a group that's targeting you. So we really need to pay attention and kind of realize that this is an everyone issue. This is not just FOG. And then what should we do about it? Let's stop paying the ransoms. I know it's very much easier said than done, and not a lot of people everyone here will agree, but maybe upper management thinks paying might just get away the issue or other issues about reputation and things like that. But they use that money, and they're kind of like an organization or a company. They have employees, they have servers, they have software. When you pay them, they upgrade their stuff. They buy more servers. They get more employees. They pay their employees. They can upgrade their tooling. Us paying them increases that happening more and more. So if we stop paying them, first they'll not be able to do that because they can't sustain and can't keep paying their employees pretty much. But also they'll realize there's no money in this area. So why don't we do something else like we've seen in other ways? So the best way to get rid of ransoms is stop doing it, but also education. The more we talk about it, the better we can be about it. A lot of ransom groups use spear phishing, other phishing attacks, or there was a talk earlier about sock foolish, things like that. That is the best way to do it is teach people, both technical and non-technical, how to kind of stop being that entry point, and that's just through education. And then lastly, there's much more investigation and threads to follow up on. There's so much we did not go through. We've only been doing this for a while. We're a small group. So there's 3 of us on the team. So there's so much more to go dig down, both in this FOG sample, but ransom as a whole and how to like kind of prevent it. So yeah, did you want to add anything with that?
Yeah, and part of what we wanted to illustrate too is that, so again, FOG is a really quiet group. There's not a lot known about them, and we needed to learn a lot, as much as we could. And so this was just sort of a description of how we came up with a process to track this group. And there's a lot of new ransomware groups that are constantly showing up like every month or so. Like we keep hearing names in the past 2 months or so that like we haven't heard before. It'll be like this brand new ransomware group is showing up on the scene. And so having a way to really quickly like gather as much information as you can about them, because the other thing is it's like, these are hacker groups. They're not exactly forthcoming with information. But coming up with a process to gather that information is important for us. So that's kind of what this whole process was. So.
And then if you go to this QR code or type in that URL if you don't like QR codes, that will take you to our GitHub, which we have all of our IOCs and the YARA rules. We will have a blog post coming out on Monday. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it until Friday, but we went way more into depth, a lot more analysis, a lot more information about FOG itself on our blog, which is coming out Monday, and we share the IOCs now and stuff like that. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, for these newer groups that are kind of popping up more frequently, are you seeing kind of a corollary like decline in the quality of the cryptors that don't play well together, and other problems that leads to kind of the things that the bigger dogs in the space criminal group, do you have any good on like Thomas Two Script?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. One, we have not done a ton of research on that yet, so that's something that we've been wanting to do for a while. So we will definitely be digging into that. But the other part to that is the U.S. government put a bunch of sanctions on ransomware groups recently. So if you pay like Lockbit, you can be like in trouble with the U.S. government now. So what these groups have realized is organizations are not paying anymore because they don't want to get in trouble. They pay and now they're in trouble, or they don't pay, they're not in like it's a kind of a mix. So what they do is they make these new groups that are not named in the sanction list, and they're just kind of acting as these groups. Now we haven't been able to verify it. That's kind of our theory, because now all of a sudden these groups, they're very similar techniques to other bigger groups and other organizations. But yeah, that's something that we're digging into now.
And then that also goes into something that Sam mentioned. You know, these groups, they have limited resources and they need stuff to get done. Like they need to pay people to run their infrastructure and to write their code. And there was actually a really good talk at DEF CON from a guy named John DiMaggio, who he infiltrated the Lockbit group. And he was watching their communications and kind of their sales pitches and all that kind of stuff. And he actually saw a lot of really weird things. Like there was a while where they didn't have a developer for their main locker file, which is kind of crazy to think about. Like you've got a ransomware group and they don't have a main developer. They were actually advertising for a developer. And then there was like other scenarios where I remember there's in one of his reports, because he was watching them for several years. There was a company that actually responded to getting ransomed by Lockbit by DDoSing them. I think the company was Entrust. But Entrust DDoSed their leak site for a few days. Oh, was it you guys? I was going to ask because I was at your talk, and it was a really, really good talk. Thank you, by the way. And so John DiMaggio reported that after that happened, all their affiliates, some of their affiliates lost on money because they couldn't sell the leak data because you were losing, there was no access to it. And what was great about that, I mean, to that question, right? Like the quality of their operations, you can hurt their operations if you hit them in the right ways. And that was a perfect example of how that can happen.
And not to fill in under you,
yeah.
We weren't actually trying to beat off. We were actually building a parser to automatically monitor when our customers didn't be about it.
Hey, I mean, I would go with the DDoS because that's
sharing between friends.
Yeah, for sure. We'll keep that with us. So, but to Sam's point, where when you pay ransoms, you give these guys resources to be able to continue their operations, and they need those because there's they need developers on their stuff. And again, like that thing that we found in their Linux locker, where it looks like they're using they rolled their own cryptor, which you never are supposed to do that. But I don't know, maybe they didn't have enough resources to properly write it. We're going to try and bust them up on that. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah. Why did they target these education groups? Is that like just some particular affiliate that focused on it, or what?
One of our IR folks happens to be here. Danny, do you know?
My guess from working on IR cases is just that school districts don't put a lot of money into securing their stuff, and they also have a whole bunch of private information. And that private information is going to be useful for a long time because the students are children.
Sorry to call you out, Danny, but you are like in the front lines for that stuff. I knew you had the info.
Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.